New videos every day.
Do you ever crave foods so much that it hurts? When you're trying to resist a food, is it almost painful? Do you ever feel like trying to give up certain foods is even harder than trying to quit smoking? Do you sometimes feel like enjoying your favorite foods is even better than sex? Well, some scientists who were wondering those same things recently did a study called Addiction-like Reward Dysfunction and Compulsive Overeating in Obese Rats, where they actually looked at rats and their consumption of junk foods and the effect on their brain. Specifically, they examined the D2 dopamine receptor system that is a known mechanism in drug addiction and obesity. They actually found that the consumption of highly palatable junk foods had a similar effect on the brain chemistry as consuming drugs like cocaine or even heroin. Here's a quote from the study. When the animal overstimulates its brain pleasure centers with highly palatable food, the systems adapt by decreasing their activity. Now the animal requires constant stimulation to avoid entering a persistent state of negative reward. So essentially, these rats developed physical addictions to these fast foods and junk foods. And that would exactly explain why we sometimes feel that we are addicted to foods and why cravings can be so intense. Scientists also found that compulsive overeating was a side effect of this decreased dopamine activity. And this would make sense because over time, your body is actually needing more and more and more of the pleasurable substance to satisfy your craving. So we know that our brains release dopamine whenever we enjoy something pleasurable like food or sex, but the alarming thing about this study is that it shows that junk foods actually stimulate the brain more than regular natural foods do, and that these foods actually cause a physical change in the brain that causes you to be addicted to the foods. What's more, if we've overstimulated our reward centers, then we'll have a harder time finding pleasure in other things. This is why a drug addict can become so consumed with their drug that they'll even neglect their physical health, their job, their family, and even sex. This would also explain why non-junk foods don't seem as pleasurable or enjoyable as their junk food counterparts. Now, maybe it's just me, but isn't it kind of disturbing to think that junk foods cause the same addiction-like process in the brain that illegal drugs do? I mean, it's one thing for a restaurant to want you to enjoy their food and become a repeat customer, but if the foods are actually causing physical changes in the brain comparable to taking some kind of controlled substance, shouldn't there at least be a Surgeon General's warning on this stuff? Warning: the food-like substance you are about to ingest contains chemicals which may be toxic, addictive, and which may cause compulsive overeating. These foods may cause you to become depressed and overweight. Please consume at your own risk. Let's look at cigarettes as an example. It wasn't until 1964 that the Surgeon General released their report exposing the hazards of smoking, and they also began requiring warning labels on cigarette packages and even restricting the advertising that tobacco companies could do. In the 1950s, 44% of Americans were smokers, and by 2005 that number had plummeted to 24%, due largely in part to the fact that people were more informed about the dangers of smoking. But there were also a lot of folks who were already addicted to cigarettes by the time that the Surgeon General stepped in. And so even though they had the information and perhaps even the intention to quit smoking, they now had a physical addiction to nicotine that they had to overcome as well. And to relate it all back to junk food, I'm afraid that America has become so full of junk food addicts that now it's going to take so much more than just simple habit changes or learning how to cook new things. But luckily, we do have the power and the free will to change our lives, take control of our health, and get rid of our junk food addictions. In 2009, ABC News ran a segment that examined a similar study, where scientists actually found that rats developed such strong addictions to junk food that even electric shock would not deter them from consuming the foods. In the interview, Dr. Braverman actually said that if you're feeling like there are certain foods you cannot resist, or you're feeling like you are addicted to certain foods, it's probably because you are. He explains that junk food addiction can be a slow process that often precedes obesity and diabetes. He goes on to say, Obesity drives disease and kills you worse than any other condition. The best way to tackle the addictive nature of these foods is to avoid becoming addicted in the first place, so we can actually prevent our children from developing these junk food addictions by only exposing them to natural foods and natural flavors. While Dr. Braverman does mention that genetics can play a role in how easily you might become addicted to junk foods, it's not genetic that you are going to be addicted to junk foods. We do have the power and the free will to take control of our brains and of our health. He goes on to say, the reality is that we live in a culture where it's a little dangerous for the brain because we're constantly bombarded by junk food, sugar, salt, and fried food everywhere. For sugar cravings, he recommends using natural sweetening flavors and even cinnamon. Agave nectar, honey, and brown sugar are all great substitutes for refined sugar and artificial sweeteners. Replacing your iodized table salt with a natural sea salt and even spices like rosemary, basil, or turmeric can go a long way to curb salt cravings. He also says, when you eat fresh spices, you supercharge your brain with high nutrient density, and you can cut your addiction and lose weight. It's a permanent change in your brain, so you'll no longer crave the junk foods. He also mentions that we could significantly improve the rates of childhood obesity by preventing our children from developing those junk food addictions in the first place. I mean, if parents really knew that the food industry was turning their kids into junk food addicts, would they be as likely to make that run through the drive-thru? Childhood obesity and diabetes is a growing problem. In just over 10 years, the rate of childhood obesity increased exponentially from 4% up to 16%. And that's especially stunning because the original name of type 2 diabetes was adult onset diabetes. But they had to change the name when they realized that even children were developing the disease. So, are junk food companies purposefully making the foods addictive, knowing that it'll cause us to overeat, to crave the foods, and to return next week? Or is it just a coincidence that the foods happen to be addictive? Well, according to the former commissioner of the FDA, David A. Kessler, junk food addiction is no coincidence. He actually wrote a book called The End of Overeating, and in it he explains that for over 50 years, food companies strove to create food that was energy-dense, highly stimulating, and that went down easy. They put it on every street corner and made it mobile. They made it socially acceptable to eat anytime and any place. They created a food carnival, and that's where we live. Now, I personally think it's pretty telling that the former FDA commissioner wrote a book about overeating, and that in it he explains that they've created a food carnival around highly stimulating foods. If it wasn't bad enough that these foods are void of nutrition and full of empty, gonna turn straight into fat calories, we are also finding now that they cause physical changes in the brain that cause us to be addicted to foods and that cause us to compulsively overeat. Now, I agree that every person has the freedom to choose what they want to eat, but I just think it's important that we have all of the information before we make those decisions. In medicine, this is called informed consent, and it just means that the doctor tells you all the pros and all the cons before you decide whether or not to have a surgery or to begin taking a prescription drug. So, informed consent for foods would be the food company fully disclosing to you all of the ingredients and the potential effects of those foods. And while most food companies do disclose their full list of ingredients, they are in no way required to tell you what those chemicals are or what the potential effects of those chemicals might be. And our goal is to give you the facts, give you the data so that you can make an informed decision for yourself and for your family. There are countless YouTube videos and pictures on the internet of fast food which has been sitting out for anywhere from 3 months to 6 years, and it has no mold, no evidence of decay, when all of us know that real food is gonna go bad. So it just begs the question, is fast food even real food? In a future video, we'll take a closer look. Anywhere from 70 to 90% of the foods that you'd find in your average grocery store are actually banned in Europe and other countries. In a future video, we're going to take a closer look at the American food industry and ask why Americans are still eating foods that have been banned in other countries due to health concerns. To check out our other recent video about junk food addiction, you can check it out right up here. And if you'd like a list of the top 10 alkalizing foods that will improve your diet and help you lose weight, you can check out my video right down here. And if you'd like to see our video talking about the difference between whole foods and processed foods for your health, you can check out this video right here. And if you've ever wondered what the difference between superfoods and junk foods is, you can check my video out right down here.